Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Mordian Glory video. In today's episode we are going to be doing a faction focus for everyone's favourite bio-horrors. It is the Tyranids. These very hungry caterpillars have been lucky enough to be chosen as the antagonist race for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. And as a result, Games Workshop has released loads of different bits of information about them over the last few weeks and months. However, they've done it all in little bits and bobs, dribs and drabs, and so what I want to do today is take all of the various Warhammer community articles, take all of the information that Games Workshop has officially released about these guys, and coalesce it all into one video so we can get a true sense of how the faction is going to feel and play in the new edition of 40k. And of course, I will be combining this with my own experience playing the Tyranids in a few tester games right here in the Mordian Battle Bunker. By the way, just in case you're curious, we do have two 10th edition battle reports available right now on the channel, and in both of those the Tyranids are featured. So not only will you be able to hear me talk about the faction here, but you'll also be able to see me use them in action in those videos, and I'll make sure to link them at the end of this one. But without further ado, let's overrun our enemies in a tide of chitin, flesh and claw and dive right into today's episode. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the overall army rules you get with your Tyranid force. In case you're not familiar with how army rules work, maybe you're new to 40k, you're getting into it with 10th edition, they're basically large overarching bonuses that you get for collecting and using a specific faction on the tabletop. It doesn't matter what kind of Tyranid army you have, whether you've gone for hordes of little bugs or a few big giant monsters. If you collect Tyranids, you will be able to benefit from these abilities in your game. Now, interestingly, Tyranids actually get two army rules. For other factions that we've seen revealed by Games Workshop, they've only got one. But I think it's because other factions have had one good one, whereas Tyranids have got two kind of okay ones. The first army rule we're going to take a look at is Shadow in the Warp. If you're a long-time Tyranid player, you'll be familiar with the general concept of this rule and the sort of lore and fluff around it. Basically, the Tyranids are such monstrous, horrible entities coming from a totally different galaxy that when they start going towards a planet, their alien influence and presence starts suppressing psychic powers on that world. And generally people get a feeling of just dread and loathing knowing that the Tyranids are drawing near. Traditionally, this army rule was focused around making enemy psykers much less potent. And if you're a long-beard Tyranid player, you might be forgiven for thinking it's still going to do that kind of effect. It's actually completely changed and it's nothing to do with psychic powers anymore. Games Workshop has instead embraced that much more general feeling of horror that people get upon seeing the Nids. As a result, the rule is now much more focused towards morale and battle shock. Specifically, what it does is if your army faction is Tyranids, then once per battle in either player's command phase, if one or more units from your army with this ability are on the battlefield, you can unleash the Shadow in the Warp. When you do, each enemy unit on the battlefield must take a battle shock test. This version of Shadow in the Warp makes it a much more offensive weapon rather than a passive defensive ability against enemy psykers. On the surface, this rule seems really powerful and impactful. Morale is much more relevant in 10th edition than it has been in previous editions. If you fail a battle shock test, you actually suffer from some debilitating debuffs. You can no longer hold objectives, your objective control goes down to 0 for that unit. You cannot be affected by stratagems, and anyone that's played 40k for any period of time will tell you that stratagems are often game winning, they are make or break. And also, if you try and fall back from combat, you have to make a desperate escape attempt. And desperate escape is when you fall back, each model in that unit has to roll a dice. On a 3, 4, 5 or 6, they manage to fall back from the combat successfully, but on a 1 or a 2, they're essentially cut down in the rout. Therefore, when used correctly in the most ideal situation with perfect conditions, Shadow in the Warp could be game winning, being able to break multiple units across the enemy front. And against factions that don't have the best leadership, you could see not only you sweeping through the mid-board, massively controlling the objectives, but also as your opponent tries to flee, you're inflicting many additional casualties on his force. However, unfortunately, rarely in games of 40k do we get our ideal situation, and rarely do we find ourselves going up against the perfect matchup. I've used Shadow in the Warp a couple of times. I used it in low level games where it should have even more of an impact, where my opponent has less redundancy and less extra units to call upon to plug any gaps where he fails his battle shock tests. And in both of those games, it did nothing. You see, I was playing against Space Marines, and they've got pretty good leadership. So when I forced them to make a bunch of battle shock tests, they just passed them. And on top of this, because it's essentially random who is going to pass their battle shock and who isn't, you have very little control on where you're going to feel the effects of this power. If you manage to break a frontline unit, that's great. You might be able to start overrunning them and causing additional casualties. But if a bunch of intercessors or a rhino towards the backfield fail this battle shock test, it really isn't such a big deal. To be honest, abilities that mess with morale and are focused on breaking the enemy have always been pretty lackluster in 40k. Even with 10th edition making great strides to try and make it more impactful, it's often less important to make your opponent's model start breaking, and it's more important to just outright kill them. An enemy model that has failed a battle shock test is still capable of putting out a lot of damage. Any model that's just dead, well, it doesn't matter if they're broken or not, they're not going to be hurting you. So I feel like Shadow in the Warp is a really cool ability, and one that if lined up perfectly could be amazing. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually do all that much to directly affect the damage output of the Tyranids. Moving on, we have Synapse, another classic rule for the Tyranids that has made it into 10th edition. Synapse is all about Tyranid morale, so rather than messing with your opponents, it's about making sure your guys stick around doing what they're told. Essentially, it represents the hive mind, the ability for the Tyranids to exert their will over the lesser organisms in their force, making sure they could drive them forward, push them into the meat grinder, heedless of casualties. In the past, Synapse essentially meant that your guys always automatically passed morale as long as they were near one of their big leader beasts like Hive Tyrants, and there were some smaller nodes as well like Tyranid Warriors. In 10th edition, it's pretty similar to that. If your army faction is Tyranids, whilst a Tyranid unit from your army is within 6 inches of one or more Synapse models from your army, that unit is said to be within Synapse range of your army. Each time a Tyranid unit from your army takes a battle shock test, if it is within Synapse range of your army, take that test on 3d6 instead of 2d6. Straight up, what I love about this rule is you take the 3d6 and you add them all together and you get one result. Games Workshop had a bad habit of introducing rules where you roll 3 dice but you only got to pick the 2 highest results. It was all a bit wanky and convoluted. If you roll 3 dice, you should be able to be affected by all of those dice, for good or for bad. And I like the fact that Games Workshop has simplified it and gone 3d6, add them all together, that is your final battle shock test. Now this might sound crazy, but after playing a couple of games, I actually think Synapse is the way more powerful rule than Shadow in the Warp. I know a lot of people, when they saw the Warhammer community article talking about these rules, they thought Shadow in the Warp was great and Synapse was terrible, but honestly, once you've used them, you realize that Shadow in the Warp is so random and it just relies upon so many different factors on your opponent's side that it's almost impossible to factor into your main plan. But Synapse is always on. It's always a possibility. There's never a bad time to pass morale. You always want to be having your units unbroken and fully operational. I guarantee you that Synapse is going to save your ass way more than Shadow in the Warp is gonna make the game for you. Look, it's all well and good being able to fuck with your opponent, but at the end of the day, the thing that really costs games is when things don't go your way because of random dice. Things just not going the way they should have done because you had a cold batch of dice. And anything that you can do to increase the reliability of your forces, get rid of that frustration, get rid of that worry, and is allowed to focus on actually strategizing and win the game, is infinitely more useful. If I was to have one tiny criticism of Synapse, it's that it should just automatically pass battleshot tests. It basically does so now, but just with extra steps. I've taken a dozen battleshot tests with my NIDs, and I've passed every single one thanks to Synapse. At this point, it feels like rolling the 3d6 is more of a ceremony than something that I actually want to be doing and that's actually going to make a difference. If you've got an ability that basically means that this is going to happen 80 to 90% of the time, let's just save everyone a bunch of time and wasted dice rolls and just make it happen automatically. And really, that's what should happen with Synapse. Overall, I think these army rules are okay. Not great, not terrible. I'd give Shadow in the Warp a 5 out of 10. In the right circumstances, it could be brilliant. But I think more often than not, you're just going to break a couple of extra units and go, oh, that was nice. Synapse, I'm going to give 8 out of 10. And frankly, if it was an auto pass, it would be a 10 out of 10. Whilst Shadow in the Warp is fairly unreliable, Synapse is really important. Overall, Tyranid creatures don't have the best leadership, and anything that can make them more reliable is going to be extremely helpful. As a result, the overall score I'm going to give to the army rules for Tyranids will be a 6.5 out of 10. Next up, we have detachment rules. Now, these are some additional army-wide benefits that you get, but you only get them if you take a certain detachment that you fit your Tyranid army into. For now, the only detachment that we are aware of is the Invasion Fleet, but the implication is that as 10th edition gets more fleshed out, or when it drops on the day, Tyranids will have multiple different detachments available to them. But the one that we can take a look at right now is the Invasion Fleet. If you take your Tyranids as an Invasion Fleet, you will gain the following benefit: hyper adaptations. At the start of the first battle round, select one of the following hyper adaptations to be active for Tyranid units from your army until the end of the battle. First one is Swarming Instincts. You get sustained hits if you target infantry or swarm. Second one is Hyper Aggression, where you get lethal hits if you target monsters or vehicles. And the last one is Hive Predators. You get precision when you roll a critical hit against an enemy character unit. When I first saw hyper adaptations, I thought they were a nice to have. Oh, that's kind of cool. I can see what my opponent has skewed his army towards, and then I can pick one of these 3 traits. And if he's got a balanced force, I can kind of just go with the one that I prefer. Now that I've actually played a couple of games, hyper adaptations is absolutely amazing. One of the most powerful abilities that we've seen for 10th edition so far. No, I'm not exaggerating. One of the biggest things that's going to catch a lot of people off guard, especially those coming in from 9th edition with a bunch of preconceptions of how the game is going to work, is making sure you have the right tool for the right job. If you do not have an anti-tank weapon and you try and shoot it at a tank, you will bounce off and do nothing. If you have an anti-tank weapon and you try and use it to kill a bunch of little horde guys, you are going to get overwhelmed by their numbers very quickly. To give you an example from one of the battle reports, I had a unit of Gene Stealers go into 10 intercessors, and I ripped every single one of those guys apart without even having to roll all of my attacks. The same unit of Gene Stealers went into a Rhino, the most basic transport you can have, and they did 4 wounds after all was said and done. Not to over-egg the pudding, but when a unit of Assault Intercessors went into my Termagants, they tore them limb from limb. When the same unit of Assault Intercessors then went into my Swarm Lord, I think they did a single wound. The point is, with big things like monsters and vehicles getting lots of toughness and extra wounds, you can't just bulldoze your way through it by trying to overwhelm them with dice. If you shoot a Swarm Lord with loads and loads of small arms and try and force him to roll a bunch of ones on his armor save, he might do that, but he could just pass all the 2-ups. It's a dice game at the end of the day. Any veteran player of 40k will tell you that a 4-up save is real swingy. It doesn't matter if statistically he fails that save 50% of the time. Sometimes he'll just pass every single one of the attacks. Sometimes he won't pass any. And it could be at the absolute worst possible moment when that luck spikes for your opponent. So circling back round to hyper adaptations, if a huge part of 10th edition is making sure that you've got that right weapon to target the right enemy, anything that you can do to influence that, anything you can do to make a square peg fit through a round hole is unbelievably valuable. Consider the following scenario. You've gone to a tournament and you've taken a balanced Tyranid list. You've got some anti-infantry, some anti-tank, you've got some little bugs and some big bugs. Because you can pick hyper adaptations after you've seen your opponent's list, you can tailor your army to deal with any skews that you come across. So for example, you might come up against a green tide. You would then pick Swarming Instincts. All of your anti-infantry weapons just got that much more efficient, and the whole advantage of a horde army making all your anti-tank weapons so much less effective and such a waste of time goes away, because your anti-tank weapons are going to benefit from sustained hits. Any sixes you get are going to increase the volume of those attacks, and so all of a sudden his army is melting way quicker than he expected it to, and his what he thought advantage has gone away. On the other hand, you might come across a mechanized player, someone with loads of infantry inside chimeras, and suddenly all your anti-infantry is becoming really ineffective because, like I said, trying to fish for sixes to wound is tough. But if you go for hyper aggression, then suddenly your opponent's advantage of making all of your anti-infantry weapons useless and really pigeonholing you into relying upon your anti-tank goes away. And you're able to stack loads of wounds on those enemy units thanks to the fact that essentially you have born soldiers against this guy's main thing. Now I bet that a lot of people see that last hyper adaptation, High Predators, and they think it's a waste of time. Because in 9th edition, snipers and anything that can pick off characters is basically useless. In 10th, nothing could be further from the truth, and especially if you're facing off against other Tyranid armies where you're going to have these big leader beasts embedded in huge blobs of Neurogaunts or Tyrant Guard, anything you can do to take out the big bug and just remove the ablative wounds from out of the equation is just amazing. I had a Swarm Lord embedded in a big brood of little Gants, and he marched across the board getting Oath of Momented the whole time, and whilst all his little bugs got stripped away, they essentially acted as a delivery system, and he got into the marine lines, and that was massive. He just tore through intercessors, terminators, and anything else that tried to stop him. If the marine player had had the ability to precisely target my Swarm Lord, that never would have happened. He would have gone down, and then all the marine player would have had to do is mop up a bunch of uncoordinated little bugs. Overall, and I don't say this lightly at all, I'm going to give hyper adaptations a 10 out of 10. It really is that powerful. So on army rules and detachments, the Tyranids are going to score a respectable 16.5 out of 20. But now let's move on to the datasheet, starting off with the big bug himself, the Swarm Lord. Now, the Swarm Lord comes with a movement of 8, toughness 10, save 2+, 10 wounds, leadership 7, and an objective control of 3. On the surface, you might be forgiven for thinking this was a downgrade, especially when you compare it to his 9th edition profile, where he had 3 extra wounds. But this does not take into account that we ain't in 9th edition anymore. We in 10th, and he has the leader ability. At the absolute bare minimum, this guy is going to be able to join a group of Tyrant Guard. And the implication from Games Workshop is he'll also able to be joined by Neurogaunts as well, giving him loads of ablative wounds. Sure, if you run the Swarm Lord across the battlefield unsupported, not a part of a unit, he'll probably get picked off. but putting him inside a squad means that you've got an absolute combat beast, which comes with a lot of wounds. But speaking of his combat potential, he comes with one ranged and one melee weapon. The ranged weapon is the Synaptic Pulse. It's a psychic and torrent weapon, so it auto hits, but I don't believe it ignores cover because it doesn't have the ignore cover rule. It's got a range of 18, it's d6 plus 3 attacks, it's strength 5, AP -1, 2 damage. Essentially, it's a short range, random shot, heavy bolter. Nice to have and a good way of clearing out marine and marine equivalent. But the real damage output is coming from his bone sabers. These are straight up twin linked, giving him inbuilt full rerolls to wound. Very, very tasty indeed. He comes with 8 attacks at a weapon skill of 2+, strength 9, AP -2, and damage 3. Now that AP is pretty respectable. Against most infantry, you're just going to cut through them. Against marines, you're going to put them down to just a 5-up save. And anything tougher than that, you're probably going to bump into an invulnerable save before any extra AP will matter. Damage 3, of course, means that this guy is one-shotting Terminators and any other infantry below that. And against vehicles, every wound he manages to get through is going to tear a decent chunk out of them. Now, he only has strength 9. I know in the context of previous editions of 40k, saying only strength 9 seems crazy, but obviously that means against some of the toughest vehicles, anything that's stronger than a Rhino, he's actually only going to be wounding on 5s. But thanks to Twin Linked giving him full rerolls to wound, it means that actually, realistically, he can go into any target and have a good chance of tearing it a new one. The 8 attacks is a pretty decent volume as well. Combined with that weapon skill 2+ means that you'll probably hit with most, if not all of them. If you then combine this with your hyper adaptations, such as Swarming Instincts, you might find that even if you get a couple of 1s here and there when you're rolling to hit, you'll probably get a couple of 6s as well, almost guaranteeing that this guy hits with every attack. He's also got a number of abilities, the first one being Hive Commander, where you gain an extra CP in your command phase, meaning over the course of a battle round, you're going to gain 3 and your opponent's only going to gain 2. This means that you've got more CP to put in stratagems, which is never a bad thing, especially when you realize that the Swarm Lord Hive Commander pairs really well with the Endless Swarm stratagem, and we'll get into that later on in this video. Further playing into the command point game, he also has the Malign Presence ability. Once per battle, after your opponent uses a stratagem, if the model is your Warlord, you can increase that stratagem's cost by 1. This seems alright. Being able to force your opponent to spend more command points than you means they have to start making some hard decisions. But I suspect that this is going to be more of a nuisance than anything else. Traditionally, these kind of abilities kind of frustrate your opponent a bit, but don't cause them to massively lose the game on their own. However, remember in 10th edition, everyone starts with 0 command points and you work your way up rather than spending on the way down as in 9th and 8th edition. So this could actually be a lot more powerful than it first seems. Next up, we have Domination of the Hive Mind. It gives him an extra bit of Synapse range, 9-inch aura. That's just good. Can't complain. Tyranids love Synapse. Anything that improves it is just solid. And of course, like most characters, he's coming with a 4+ invulnerable save. And the last thing to mention is he is an epic hero, so you can't take 3 Swarm Lords in your army. There is only 1. Adding all of this together, and you've got a pretty solid datasheet from the Swarm Lord. I think a lot of people are overlooking the leader ability and are assuming that he's going to be 1v1 in Guilliman and stuff like that. That's not going to happen. If the Swarm Lord ever does go into Guilliman, the Primarch is going to have to wade through a bunch of crappy gaunts or dead-eyed Tyrant Guard before they ever get to the Swarm Lord himself. In the meantime, the Swarm Lord can just start hacking and whacking and smacking against the Primarch of the Ultramarines, and will probably get a couple of rounds of combat in before he has to worry about actually tanking the hits himself. From one big bug to another, now we are going to take a look at the brand spanking new Screamer Killer Carnifex. This guy absolutely stole the show at Warhammer Fest and is probably the most anticipated model for the new Tyranid range. And he's got a pretty impressive stat line to say the least. Almost on par with the Swarm Lord despite the fact he's just a regular bug. He's got a movement of 8, toughness 9, 2+ save, 10 wounds, leadership 8+, and OC of 3. That toughness combined with the 2+ save and the high number of wounds is going to make him pretty much immune to small arms fire. Trying to chip this guy down is going to be woefully inefficient. However, he doesn't have leader, so no ablative wounds. A few well-aimed las cannon volleys should be enough to bring this guy down. You see what I mean about having the right tool for the right job? In terms of weapons, he has got 2, a ranged and a melee. His ranged weapon is the Bioplasmic Scream. It is assault and it is blast, meaning he can move and advance and scream at you. And for every 5 models in your unit, he's going to get +1 attack. He's got an 18-inch range, so he's got a hell of a pair of lungs on him. And it is D6 +3 attacks at strength 8, AP -2, and 1 damage. But the real kicker is that ballistic skill of 4+. Many shots are going to go wide, and combined with the 1 damage means that this might kill a Marine or 2, but overall it's not the main reason you should be taking him. Because he is a melee beast, and that is where he belongs. These Screamer Killer Talons are brilliant. He gets 10 attacks, weapon skill 3+, strength 10, AP -2, flat 3 damage. That's more attacks than the Swarm Lord. That's more strength than the Swarm Lord. Don't forget that this guy will benefit from your hyper adaptations. So if you start putting him against vehicles, you could go for those lethal hits. Or if you put him against enemy swarms, 10 attacks has the potential to generate loads of sustained hits, meaning that he'll be able to slice through hordes and vehicle armies with ease. He's only got 1 ability, but it's a good one. Death Scream allows you to pick 1 unit that you've hit with the Bioplasmic Scream and force it to take a Battle Shock test, subtracting 1 from that result. There's a number of ways that you can use this. Firstly, you could scream 1 enemy unit, and then if you break it, you can charge another, and if you do enough damage to that one, you might break that one too in the subsequent command phase, causing your opponent to have 2 units which aren't really doing what he wants them to do. Or you could really concentrate on 1 enemy unit. You could scream it, and then if it breaks, that's brilliant. If it doesn't, you can then charge it, try and do damage to it, and then if it breaks, brilliant. And then if it still hasn't, and it's a really important one, you need to make sure that it just is not holding that objective or can't fall back without taking casualties or whatever problem you are aiming for with Battle Shock. If it still hasn't broken, you could then also use Shadow in the Warp to try a 3rd Battle Shock test on a single enemy unit. As far as we're aware, there's nothing that says you can't take multiple Battle Shock tests in a battle round. But this guy could be causing all sorts of morale shenanigans, and he pairs pretty well with Shadow in the Warp. But moving away from the big bugs, let's take a look at the little scuttling horrors, starting with the Gene Stealers. Gene Stealers are the elite shock troops of the Hive Fleet. They're less numerous than Gaunts and Gants, but they are way more deadly, and they have a stat line to reflect this. They've got a movement of 8, which allows them to scuttle across the board pretty quickly, especially when you combine that with their pre-game scout move of 8 inches as well. Even if you don't go first, having a pre-game move of 8 inches is nice against another heavy assault enemy army like World Eaters, where you want to slow them down and only let them fight things that you want them to fight. Having the ability to essentially put a screen of Gene Stealers in the mid-board could really set up some good counterattacks. Toughness 4 and a 5+ save is okay, means that small arms like lasguns are going to struggle to wound you a bit. But when they do, you've only got a small chance of saving it, and Bolt of Fire can go either way. The biggie, though, is the fact they now come with 2 wounds. 2 wound Gene Stealers is horrific. Not for the Tyranid player, for their opponent. Taking 3 squads of 10 of these guys is 60 wounds. They are twice as durable as they were. And when you take into account their melee weapons, Even if a handful of these guys make it to you, which they're much more likely to do now, they are going to tear through any infantry you have. Each Gene Stealer comes with claws and talons. This gives them 4 attacks at weapon skill 2+, strength 4, AP -2, and 1 damage. On its own, this is a good weapon. High volume of attacks, fantastic weapon skill combined with just enough strength and AP to get the job done. But when you take into account Vanguard Predator, it becomes bonkers. These guys will clear any objective of any infantry in the game. Vanguard Predator gives you reroll wound rolls of 1, just generally speaking. But when you are attacking an enemy unit on an objective, you get full rerolls to wound. This massively spikes their damage against their intended target, infantry. But even with Vanguard Predators, Gene Stealers are going to struggle to tear open vehicles, even basic ones like Rhinos. And an enemy Dreadnought sat on an objective is probably these guys' worst nightmare, because it's going to punch them back and their 2 wounds aren't going to mean a huge amount. The last data sheet that GW has previewed is the Humble Termagant. These little worker bees are basically unchanged from 9th to 10th. Of course, their datasheet has been brought in line, so they've got the new leadership and objective control, but they're the same termagants that you know and love. You need to bring them in large numbers, and they're cannon fodder to absorb bullets for your other units. Even though we've only seen the new models with flesh borers, it appears they still have access to all of their traditional termagant weapons, like the Spine Fist and the Termagant Devourer as well. The stats for all of these weapons are what you would expect. Flesh Borer is a range 18-inch assault weapon. It has 1 shot, it's ballistic skill 4+, strength 5, AP dash, damage 1. It has lost a pip of AP from 9th edition, but this was to be expected as Games Workshop did say that the AP for most weapons was going to go down. Termagant Spine Fists are assault pistol twin linked. They've got a 12-inch range and they've got 2 attacks, which is alright. Ballistic skill 4+, strength 3, AP nothing, damage 1. It's alright, the Spine Fist. I think it's a big improvement over the current Spine Fist, but the current one was so unusably bad that almost anything would have been an improvement. And if Games Workshop had removed it, I think most Tyranid players would have just seen it as being taken out of its misery. The one weapon which I feel has taken a downgrade is the Termagant Devourer. It's no longer assault, combined with its short range means that it might take a turn or 2 for you to actually start firing off, and even when you do, it now only has 2 shots. I'm pretty certain that Devourers in the past had 3, although veteran Tyranid players, let me know down in that comment section below. Out of all the weapons, I think the Flesh Borer will be the go-to. That extra strength is more important than ever before. It allows you to actually wound Rhinos and other light vehicles on 5s rather than 6s. Termagants also have a really cool ability, Skulking Horrors. Once per turn, when an enemy unit ends a normal, advance, or fallback move within 9 inches of this unit, if this unit is not within engagement range of 1 or more enemy units, it can make a normal move up to D6 inches. I feel like in the hands of a wily opponent, this is really powerful. I've got a few scenarios running through my head on how I think this could be used. Straight up, if someone moves towards you, trying to get a charge off, if they are going for a bit of a long bomb one, you could just move D6 inches away and make it so they have no chance of getting that charge off. Essentially, they could be left out in no man's land, dicks in hand, pissing into the wind, unable to get that charge off, and then in your turn, you turn around and either countercharge or just shoot them to death. You might be able to use it to scuttle onto an objective, giving you extra primary points in your turn. Or, if your opponent moves towards you, you can then move towards them with this, move blocking them, and potentially pushing back any deep strikers they've got coming in, because that happens at the end of the movement phase in the reinforcement step. But that covers the data sheets, and they all look really good. There's no bad ones. Everyone's got a decent ability or stat line, or both. In fact, even though we've not seen the points, and of course they can make a huge difference in determining whether a unit is viable or not, I am comfortable with giving the overall score for the datasheets as a solid 8 out of 10 for the Tyranids. But now let's take a look at the last few little bits that Games Workshop has previewed, and we've got a stratagem and a weapon to review. The stratagem is Endless Swarm. It costs 1 command point, you do it in your command phase, and you get to target 2 Endless Multitude units from your army that are in Synapse range, or 1 that is outside of it. Now, we don't know exactly what units are Endless Multitude, but we do know that termagants have that key word. So at the very least, you'll be able to target them, and I suspect that any of the smaller swarm bugs are going to benefit from it. Neurogaunts and Hormogaunts as well. Each unit affected by the stratagem regains D3+3 destroyed models. If you get this off on 2 squads, you could regain an average of 10 little bugs, and maybe even as many as 12. I very much like the stratagem, and I think it's got a number of battlefield applications. At the most basic level, you can use it to replenish units into your swarms of bugs that you're pushing forward on the assault. This allows you to keep the momentum going, and anything that essentially gives you 3 points over the course of the game is never a bad thing. It's also a brilliant defensive stratagem. You've got a couple of Gantt squads that are holding backfield objectives. Being able to reinforce them makes them a lot less susceptible to indirect fire like mortars. Last but certainly not least, this is potentially very exciting with the new Neurogaunts. If they've got Endless Multitude and you can attach leader bugs to them, it means you have a regrowing delivery system for those very powerful Synapse creatures. But as for the weapon preview, we get to have a good old look at the Tyrannofex's double dick gun, the Rupture Cannon. Now on the surface, this gun looks pretty good. Got a 48-inch range, standard for a heavy weapon. It's got 2 attacks, ballistic skill 3+, and if you stay still, it'll be a 2+, thanks to the heavy keyword. Strength 18, wow, and AP -4. It's definitely going to punch through some tanks. But it has an Achilles heel. It's a big old weakness, and that is the damage. It's 2d6. That makes it real swingy. You could fire this at a rhino and leave it as a puddle of metallic goo on the floor, or you could blow off a radio antenna and do 2 damage, at which point the rhino self-repairs 1 wound and you've done 1 damage and you're there questioning your life choices. I think the very swingy nature of this random damage is going to put a lot of people off the Tyrannofex and the Rupture Cannon. But to be fair, the rest of its stats are so good, so punchy and powerful, that it kind of needed something to balance it out. Although I suspect a lot of Tyranid players would have been happy with less strength and less AP and a fixed damage value. I'm going to give the stratagem and weapon preview a 6.5 out of 10. Endless Swarm is brilliant, but if your opponent just concentrates fire and leaves no survivors, you're not going to get a chance to use it. And the Rupture Cannon could do a lot of damage, or it could do very little. I think both of these things have got the potential to be really, really good, but they're also not guaranteed. And that brings us to the end of the Tyranid faction focus, with the bugs scoring a very respectable 31 out of 40. I think Games Workshop has done a good job of making the bugs seem like a fairly balanced force. They've got some strong data sheets and abilities, but we can see that they're not perfect. Their army rules could do with a little bit more, but their detachment rules are fantastic. Their stratagems look good, but 1 or 2 of their weapons do leave a bit to be desired. Of course, we've not seen the full thing yet. We'll have to wait for the index and subsequent codex to come out. But my instinct is that Games Workshop have got the Tyranids right. They're going to be fun and flavorful, but with just the right amount of power as well. But all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed today's video, make sure you smash that like button and also subscribe to never miss an episode. If you want to go the extra mile and support the channel whilst also unlocking a bunch of cool perks as well, consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. One of the biggest perks you get for becoming a supporter is you gain access to the Mordian Glory Discord, an online community of almost 1,500 active people. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got army lists, tactics, painting, hobbying. In fact, we're running a painting competition right now, and we've even got a pretty spicy meme section too. And I just want to take a moment to say a big thank you to the latest channel members. So a massive thank you to Blanco, Lost Soul, Gripstar, Gordon Grenadier, Shackleton Magram, Scott Tennant, Dalesguard, Advocate, Kevin Sharp, and David Shearer. I also want to shout out the latest Patreons as well, so a big thank you to Jonathan Jacobson, Flimdrake, Skeletor1695, and Demaker777. And last, but certainly not least, I want to say a personal, heartfelt, special thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a massive thank you to Alan Blunt III, Bon Vert, Mark Panconi, Ross Miller, Swordfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Diesel Fox, August Varney, and Absolute Rubbish. Thank you to all of you guys. Your incredible support makes a huge difference, and I really couldn't do Mordian Glory without you. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching, and of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.